Welcome to Module 4 of Using Vue with ASP.NET Core by Example. My name is Sean Wildermuth of Wilderminds. In this module, we'll talk about composing with components. We'll start with the idea of composition of an application. We'll build our first component. I'll talk about component properties, registering components, component events, component slots, and then remote templates. Let's get started. Earlier in the course, we talked about composition in using Vue.js as well as your code and allowing you to use browser-ready code to build web pages. When I talk about composition, I'm really talking about something a little deeper. In this case, I'll talk about Vue.js and then your code that's going to be using Vue.js, and you're going to be able to be building components, sometimes main components that represent the entire web page, and then using other components that can contain other components that can contain other components. And even other parts of the main component might have other components and more components, and these can even be multiple use of the same components. So when we talk about composition, we're talking about breaking down our applications into smaller and smaller units that we can build and we can test in efficient ways before we compose our application of a lot of these smaller pieces. And that's where we're headed with the idea of building components. You can think about components themselves as being some discrete set of functionality. Of course, all of this is happening in service to the application or the web page you're trying to build. But we want to get down to where we're not building a monolithic application, but smaller and discrete pieces that are easier to build, especially as we get into large, complicated web pages. Composition is laying the groundwork for the beginning of something we might start to think about as a single-page application. Composition on itself doesn't mean single-page application. This can just be a more complicated enhancing of a web page, or it could mean one of these monolithic single-page applications. Either way, we're heading towards that larger application as we continue down through the course. Let's build a component. So let's build your first component. Back here in the project that we ended in Module 3, let's go ahead and open up the checkout.js page. Now, much like what we've done before, this is just a Vue object that has some different sections, and we're going to create a brand new section here called components. And we're going to build our first component as a weight cursor. The component itself is just some smaller piece of the application. And so this weight cursor is a fully self-contained piece of functionality. And so let's start by just specifying a template. If we go back over to our index.cshtml, we actually have what looks like a weight cursor already. If you remember, we had this div for, if it's busy, show this alert. So I'm just going to copy this whole alert we have here. Not going to remove it, I'm just going to copy it, and I'm going to make it the template for my new component. And in this case, I'm just going to clean it up for a minute. We're going to come back and make some of this happen, but we're just going to say a div with a little spinner, an alert. So the template just is this piece of HTML. It's important that the template itself has a single root component. So in this case, what we're actually doing here, so I'm going to break it into multiple lines. Notice I'm using the back single quote to allow JavaScript to let us have multiple lines. So this div represents a single root component. Doesn't matter what's inside the div. So this template has to have a single root element that represents the template. So that means that there has to be a single element, a div, or it could be a paragraph, or it could be anything, as long as there's only one that represents the root of this component. What's inside of it can be quite complex, but in our case, it has to be a single, in this case, a div. So now that we have this cursor here in our checkout, and all I'm doing so far is just creating the template. I'm not adding any other functionality yet. I just want essentially this component to be stuck on the page. So let's open up our checkouts.cs HTML, and right above the div for the error, let's go ahead and put our weight cursor. What we're going to do is we're going to take the name we have given it here, and we can use it as an arbitrary element. So in this case, we're defining the component with just a JavaScript or camel-cased object here. So in our checkout, we can include that, but we can also include it by something called kebab case. And kebab case is where it's all lowercase, and it uses dash to separate them. And this is preferred because it makes it easier for the elements and the DOM to actually manipulate these if you need to write code against them later. So the suggestion is usually just to go ahead and name them either a name here that you know will be turned into kebab case, or my preference is just to actually use kebab case everywhere, just so there's no confusion. So I'll name the component wait cursor, and then here at checkout, wait cursor should work. Let's look at the browser. And if we go to the checkout page, we'll see this inserted in there for us. Now, we don't have any logic associated with it, with hiding it or showing it when work is actually being done, but at least we're seeing that it's actually showing up in the way we might want. Next, let's add some properties to our component so that we can actually communicate data from the owning view down into the component. Let's do that next. So now let's take a look at adding properties to our components. Back in the checkout.cshtml, here's our wait cursor that we placed, and I'd like to replace the message with one of our own. So let's go ahead and create a message property, and I just want to be able to do something like sending message, right? Something that the wait cursor is going to take and place inside of the template for us. But how do we make this functionality actually work? If we go back to checkout, we can add another property called props. And this can take an array with the name of each property that we want to support. In this case, one of the properties we want to support is actually message, just like we had specified in the checkout. Here's that property message. Now, for now, these aren't typed. So it can be any really object. We'd probably want it to be a string, but for now we're going to make the assumption that it's going to be a string. And let's go ahead and replace the loading in the template here with just binding to our own properties. If we do this right and refresh, we'll see that our message now says sending message because we've created a property and then we've sent data down through it. The other option for setting these properties is give it an object syntax. And the difference with the object syntax versus the array is we can actually include information about it, like what type is it? And this will give you warnings during the development process whether this message is set from an actual string. Now, this isn't going to guarantee that it's going to be this way in runtime. There are no runtime checks for this, but it will help you to debug problems if you start using the wrong properties for the wrong names. Let's create another property we might want to use here, and we'll call it busy. These property names are also going to be kebab cased for you. So if we wanted to say is busy, we couldn't do that. We'd actually want it to be is busy. But I'm going to leave it as busy for now. And type is going to be Boolean. And I'm going to tell it that it is required so that the user has to actually specify it. Otherwise, we'll get a warning inside the console. So that means if I want to actually show and hide this, I'm going to have to specify busy as something. Now, busy being an attribute, I want to actually bind it to the underlying view. So I'll go ahead and use the vbind to bind the busy to a new property we'll call isBusy that we haven't actually implemented yet. But let's go ahead and put it there in isBusy. And then on our checkout page up here, let's create a new property in our view itself called isBusy, and we'll make it false to begin with. And then we can use it here on the saves so that right after we clear the error, we can say this dot is busy equals true. So while the data is actually being posted, we'll go ahead and show that is busy. If it succeeds, we'll set it to false. And if we have an error, we'll also set it to false. And because we're using the this pointer here, let's go ahead and bind this to this like we've done before so that we can actually use the data in our control. And this is all not in the component, but actually in the view itself. The reason we're doing that is so that in our checkout, we can bind this busy property of wait cursor to the isBusy flag of our actual view. It's allowing us to send data from the owning component, or in our case, owning view, down into the component. Because we're doing it that way, we can then use the busy here to simply say vif busy. So because this is being bound to the property, I can then use it in the template to show or hide the entire wait cursor. Now, we could surely have done here instead of just putting wait cursor vif is busy and not had to have that property. But I like actually to have the property because some parts of the component may not be the part you're going to show and hide. You may have, the frame or some other piece that's going to take up real estate. You're really hiding the guts of that component. So this allows us to not only set properties that are going to be sent down to the component, but also bind to those properties that are set down to the component. So if we've done this right, we can see we're actually going to get an error here. What's actually happening is this string is not actually defined. And the reason for that is that string isn't an actual known type. Notice that when we did the Boolean is capitalized, and therefore it's a type. This just thinks it's an any, which means we probably need to capitalize it. You can see that we now have string as a type of object. Now if we refresh, we should see it being hidden at first. And let's see, let me make it a little smaller so we can see on the screen. We have all the properties in. We should see the sending a message being set, and then after the pop-up, it should go away again. So we're actually using that binding mentality to work in this exact way we want it to. Having this component is useful, but we might want to use it on the index page as well. Let's see how that's different. So now let's talk about registering components. If we look at the checkout, we'll see that we have used this wait cursor in the way we want to on this page, but I'd love to be able to open up the index.cs.html class and replace our code here with another wait cursor. And let's put the message as loading data, and let's put the busy is busy, right? We're just going to bind to the is busy. We should get the same experience on the index. If we refresh this home page, you might not notice, but we should be getting a brief flash of that loading panel. In fact, if we go ahead and use the debugging to inspect the element, we can see that wait cursor is here. Should it really look like wait cursor though? It should be being replaced with what Vue thinks is that component. And the reason this is happening is the browser itself will take any named element and just treat it like a div. And there's nothing to show here, so it just ends up not taking any space. But our wait cursor isn't actually working. The reason is if we look at the checkout, we have this component as part of our checkout.js, which of course isn't being used on the index page. The index page has its own JavaScript file. So we might want to copy this over to that, but that really doesn't lend us to be reusing this everywhere we want to be reusing it. So instead, let's move this entire component to its own JavaScript file. And I'll just call this wait cursor. And instead of having a section called components, we're going to actually call view.component. And then we're going to give it a name, which in this case is going to be wait cursor. And the second parameter is that same object syntax that we saw with our component development when it was inside of a view. So in our case, we're saying that this view component is going to be globally registered. It's going to be available for anyone as long as this wait cursor.js is actually included on the page. So let's come over here to our checkout, and I'm going to drag our wait cursor to happen before our checkout. If we go to the checkout page, a little hard to tell because you can't see it, but when we go ahead and process it, we'll see it show up here in sending message. Then when we go home, go ahead and open that index.cs.html. We also have to include wait cursor here before the index page. And once we do that and refresh this page, we'll see it so fast you can't tell, but it actually is being shown here. And I can prove it by going to inspect element. We can see this comment. This comment is actually where that wait cursor lives, but because it is hidden right now, it has been removed from the DOM for us. We can actually see this happen. If we come here into the debugger, just to prove I'm not lying to you, let's go to the call for setting of the products, which is going to happen before we clear the is busy, and we'll see our loading data appear. This is the same wait cursor that we're using in both places. Because it's being registered globally, we can use that and reuse that element anytime we want. And so you can make decisions about component level or global level registration of your components. It depends on whether you're trying to use some composition to build these individual components to be used globally, or whether they're just part of another component or even part of a whole view that you're using. Get rid of that breakpoint and we'll see it all disappear. Now that we've built a simple component, let's build something with a little more muscle to it. Let's go ahead and add a cart component for here right on the main page. We're going to start by first creating a JavaScript file, and I'll call it the cart.js. And this is going to be a new component we're going to use, and I'll just call it the cart. And I'll just use an empty object for what the cart actually represents. And we'll start with a template. So the template is going to have some look and feel to it. So I could start with just a quick H3 that says shopping cart. And that would be fine because because it has this one solitary component on it, but we're going to have to add more stuff to it. So I want to make sure I have a single root element that makes a little bit more sense. So I'm going to create a new div, and I'm going to use Bootstrap classes of card and P2, which will just give us a little padding inside that card. And so we can see all we have at this point is just a card element and then just shopping cart. We haven't done a lot here with the cart yet. We haven't made it fully functional, but let's go ahead and open it up in our index, and let's add that cart to our project. There's the cart.js, and then we can actually use it on the page. If you remember, we have this set of products here, and then each of those products is going to be column 4. But if we were to take this whole section inside the index page that represents the product list, and let's go ahead and wrap it with a div, and then I'm just going to put in a class here that says column 8. And I'll go ahead and wrap this whole thing again so that I can specify a row. Again, these are both semantics of Bootstrap. If you're using another layout, you could do another layout. And I said 8 because I want it to take up about 2/3 of the page, and then I'm going to create a new one of these for column 4 to take up the other third. And this is where I'm going to actually put in the cart. So left and right will have the same product page with the same sort of requirements, but we're going to squeeze it down to 2/3 of the page and then put our cart on the right-hand side. If we go back to the browser and refresh, we'll see that we now have our shopping cart, and we now have all the functionality on the left-hand side, though a little squished. We'll probably find out later we're going to want to make this a little prettier, but for now it'll be good enough. So we've created our second component on our page, but we haven't really created any functionality here. What we're going to want here in the shopping cart is just a list of the items in the cart. So if we come back over to our cart, let's go ahead and add a simple table. And this table is going to use a V4 in order to create a row for each line item in the items. So items are a new property we're going to want to include. So let's go ahead and include that props property like we did before, and we'll say items type equals array and required equals true. So we're going to have an items element tied up here so that we can take the items and then create a line item for each one of those. And that line item is going to include the name of the product, the price of the product, and the quantity of the product. So how do we make this actually happen? We open up the index page.js. Let's add a new property here for, let's say, cart items. And it's just going to be an empty array to begin with. This is going to allow us on the page to go ahead and say items, cart items, right? Just going to take the cart items that we have and we're controlling on our main page, and we're going to send them down to the cart in order to be displayed. This is going to allow us on our index page to actually implement the buy here. And what's this buy going to do? We have the product being sent down, so what we'd like to do is just say this.cartitems.push, so push a new object in here that's going to include a bit of information. It's going to include a new object that has the name as the product.name, price as product.listPrice, and quantity as just 1. Every time someone presses buy, we'll go ahead and say 1, we'll add it to the cart items, and hopefully push it down into the cart so it can be shown. I'm also going to include a code, and this code is the actual product code that the product has. This way we can find them later to be tied to the actual product. And that is a property called GTIN code. So let's see if this works. If we refresh the page, when we press buy, we should start to see these show up as items in the shopping cart. We've done that by the product list itself is owning that cart data, whether it's the right thing to do or not, but it's owning that cart data. And then as we press buy, it's adding this new object that the shopping cart can now see. We can see the name, we can see the price, and then of course we can see the quantity. Well, what happens if we press vanilla pudding a second time? We're going to actually get a second vanilla pudding. So this quantity isn't being used yet. Let's fix that. What we really want to do here is see if we can find the cart. We're going to use Lodash, let's go ahead and create a line object by calling Lodash, which again is that underscore. And I'm just going to use find to find something in the this.cart items. And I'm looking for it as the code equals product.gtin code. So this is a Lodash functionality that says go find an item in cart items that matches the property code, and this is the value of the code, and if so, return it to us as a line. Then I can just say if line exists, go ahead and just say line.quantity increment. Else, we don't have that product yet, and so go ahead and create the new product with the one quantity. With this change of using Lodash, which I believe we're already using on our page, Lodash, if we refresh, we should be able to say buy one pudding, buy one digital wrist, and when we say buy a pudding again, should change that quantity to 2, 3, 4, 5. So we now have a more realistic sort of component. We want to create this shopping cart component that is using just the piece of information we want. Now, if you took this course and stopped here, you might be saying, but you really haven't wrapped much of the functionality inside the component. You've left it all in this product list. And trust me, keep on going. Once we get through a few more modules, you'll start to see how this all works. This isn't the way I recommend you build Vue yet. We're getting to some place with a story, so don't get too critical quite yet. Let's look at component events next. So now let's see how components can raise events. So I'm going to go back to the cart and I'm going to add a new column here. This column is going to be a little bit more interesting in that we're going to have just a quick button in this column that has a times or an X to say, let's go ahead and delete based on this button being pressed. This is going to allow us to actually clear a line item in our cart. If we look at this and add a couple of things, you'll see this new button being shown here. And if I click on it, I want to add the functionality of deleting it from the cart. The way we're going to do that is to actually add a VOnClick that's going to call a method either on the component or just in line. And I'm just going to do it in line for now. And I'm going to say emit, $emit, which is a Vue function that's exposed here. And I'm going to allow it to emit an event. And this event is just a named message. You shouldn't get too caught up in calling them events, but we're going to treat them like the DOM events that we're already handling, like the VOnClick. That's an event that's actually a DOM event. We're extending our component to be able to expose their own event. And this one I'll call delete item. In this case, when the button inside the component is clicked, the cart component itself is going to fire a delete item event. And so we can say on delete item, what do we want to do? We want to on delete item, right? And in this case, I'm not going to give it the parentheses. I'm going to allow any parameters that are being fired from delete item to be sent down to this handler. So if we come back to the cart component, is I'm going to actually tell it that I want you to delete this line item. So I'm going to pass in, because again, we're in the data binding scope of this v4, I'm just going to include the whole line that I want you to delete from. And that way, when I handled this on delete item handler in the actual code here, I'm just going to go down to methods and add on delete item function. But this time I'm going to include that line that's being sent to us from the client component. So in onDeleteItem, I'm just going to use Lodash again. I'm going to use a command called pull that will take out an element for us. So I'll give it the cart items, and then I'll just say remove this individual line item, the one I actually want to delete. If I come here and I, let's say, buy a couple of items, I can use the Vue dev tools to look at the state of our Vue object. The way we can see this is if we go to vue.org, inside the ecosystem, there's something called dev tools. And dev tools, if you look down a little bit, they'll show you the installation for the Chrome extension and the Firefox extension, as well as the Electron app, to allow you to use these specific tools for Vue. These will give you a shortcut into the actual views. And the only thing you'll have to be sure of is when you look at the view here, it'll say it's been detected, but if it says it's been disabled, almost always that is because you've used the vue.min version instead of the full Vue version. But since we have this enabled, if we go ahead and look at the console, we'll see that there is a Vue tab, and the Vue tab has the different components we're using. See the root view itself, and then the different components that are in here. So we look at the root view, we'll see that our array has two objects of our cart items, so that represents them here. If I delete one, we'll see that the view isn't changing, but if I move off of root and come back, that pull method actually did what it was supposed to do. It removed the cart items, but because it wasn't in a way that Vue expected it, it didn't update the UI. And this is a very interesting piece here. The way that Vue works is they're trying to implement getters and setters and other sorts of replacing default implementations, including the functions on array itself, on the array prototype, in order to know about this reactivity, in order to change the UI. Because we're using this thing it doesn't know about, poll, instead of the built-in cartItems.splice, there's no way for Vue to know that we've actually changed that. Now, there's some hacks there to force it to refresh and things like that, but I'm not going to go through those because I really want you to instead use the actual array methods themselves, because in this case, it's not a simple property change. We're changing the state of a collection, and we want the UI to change from it. We have to be a little bit more careful. We're going to do this by finding the index of the object, so we can still use Lodash or something like it to help us. We just can't change the cart items itself with Lodash in this case. So I'm going to say find index, and I'm going to give it the cart items, and I'm going to look for code equals line.code. So I'm looking for the index itself, not the actual full line item. And it ends up meaning we want to do more than we might imagine. But in this case, I can go ahead and say splice from the index, delete 1, and this will actually change the cart items to remove the item at the number of index. We end up having to use these old APIs, part of array, that frankly are a little nasty, but this will certainly get the job done. If we go back, refresh our page, buy a couple of items, when we delete them, they'll actually delete. And the reason for this, again, is Vue is monitoring the array methods that are built in so that it knows that something about the collection has actually changed. If you don't know that this is the case, this can become really nasty really quick. And so that's where something like the Vue debug extensions or dev tools become really, really useful. Remember, all this started simply by being able to use emit to expose an event up through the owner of our component. Let's take a look at slots next. So now let's talk about a concept called slots. To go back to our cart itself, and here's the template for our whole cart, but we'd love to be able to put inside of the cart some information that maybe is passed down to us from the consumer here. And it may be not something as simple as a property or alerting events, which is a way to send data down and fire events back up, but we may want to actually put some markup that is used. And that's where the idea of slots comes in. Let's start in this template, and right after shopping cart, I'm just going to create a section that's just going to be called slot. And this is just an element with the word slot in it. And what this allows us to do when we use our cart is whatever is put on the inside of our cart here, like I'll just put hello world for now, will be injected into this part of the template. So this is allowing us to specify some content that is being injected inside of the template of the cart itself. If we refresh our page, we can see that hello world, even though it's being owned by product, directly in here. And where it can be really useful is let's, instead of hello world here, let's just make a little div that's going to contain a subtotal. And in order to have the subtotal, I'm just going to have a property, or more importantly, a computed property called subtotal. And I'll use money as a filter to go ahead and make that pretty. So let's talk about creating this subtotal. Back in our indexpage.js, let's come to the bottom and let's create yet another section called computed. This is going to be a list of computed properties. And so in our case, I'm going to call it subtotal. And this is going to be a function that will then return data whenever subtotal is called. So I'm going to say return, and I'm going to use Lodash again to just do a sum by. In this case, I can say this dot cart items, and then I'm going to use another callback function to do the actual summing. So here I'm going to say return C for the cart, and I'm going to say price times quantity. So when this computes this, it's going to go through all the cart items, call this function for each line, and each line is essentially going to be the price times the quantity, and it's going to return a subtotal that contains a total of the quantity and price summed up for us. So let's see what this looks like. If we refresh, we can see that the subtotal is now 0, and if we go ahead and buy some items, that subtotal is actually going to start doing what it's supposed to be doing. It knows that on every cycle of updating this component that we're going to probably need to recalculate that computed, because some amount of data has changed. And so it can be very useful for putting these things. Now again, I'm using this slot here to put in that subtotal. So the cart could also have named slots. There can always be one slot that is the default here, but I can also put, let's include the slot there, and let's include another slot down here, but let's give it a name, and let's call it the footer. And what this would allow us to do is have some arbitrary markup here inside of our cart, and that always goes to the unnamed slot. But I could also have Put another one that says thank you for shopping or whatever you want it to say. And then I would just say slot equals and then the name of the named slot. In this case, I'm going to move our subtotal down to the footer. Again, this one automatically goes along with anything else in here that doesn't have the idea of footer there. And then we can see the thank you for shopping in the unnamed slot, and then the subtotal is now in the footer named slot. And the other stuff we're getting is still being shown in the middle, just like we can expect. And this idea of slots allows you to specify different parts of the template that you want the user to be able to replace. This allows you to start putting together more complicated and complex components, not that just show information, but also take markup that the user of the component is using and inject it into your template. Let's talk about remote templates next. So now let's talk about remote templates. If we look at our cart here, as this cart has gotten more and more complicated, the idea of this template being a magic string here, without any help from the tooling to be able to create HTML that has some of the helpers and is validating that it's a good HTML and all that other stuff, becomes sort of annoying to me. I don't like the way this looks. And so what I'd like to do, like I've used in some other libraries, is be able to do something like template URL and then point it at some file. In fact, let's move this whole template into another file. I'm going to create a new directory called templates, and then I'm just going to create cart.html for actual template, and I'll just replace that with our cart template itself. And we can see that now that we have it in here, we can do formatting. We are getting good coloring. Any weird problems with format, we're going to start to get errors. So if I did something like self-closing I, it would immediately complain that there's something weird and wrong there, etc. Right? We're going to get to be able to use the tools for this. But there is nothing super built into Vue to do this idea of remote templates. Being able to use templates from separate files is something they purposely sort of wanted you to avoid. They wanted you to be able to use them, but they expected that if you were going to get to that level, you were going to start to use some of the other tooling like Webpack or Browserify or those sorts of things that would sort of solve this outside of this. But I wanted to be able to use the external tools, and then of course that would be replaced if I ended up making the project complicated enough to want to use Webpack or Browserify or one of those guys. So how would we do this? Vue has the idea of asynchronous components, and we're going to use that to create our remote templates, but it actually could be used for a number of different things. The idea here is instead of specifying the component as an object, what you would actually do for the second parameter here, going to pass a function that's going to give us a resolve and a reject parameter here, so that if we want it to be asynchronous, we can just call resolve and then pass in the data that represents the template. So in this case, the data is what? It's this little piece. And so by calling resolve, we're really saying, make this asynchronous, but we're not going to call resolve quite yet. What I'm going to use is that XS project and just say get templates cart.html. I'm just going to use the networking we already have built in to go ahead and get the HTML as an arbitrary body, and then just handle the success case in order to resolve. There's our big resolve here. And what will the template be then? The template will be res.data, or the data that is being sent back through the get from Axios. So this template is just the text that we went and did a get on, but because this can be asynchronous, this will allow us to do it in an asynchronous way. But of course, we can still then call catch and call reject to explain that we actually had an error condition. Something bad happens when we try to call get to get the template, and then we're going ahead and rejecting it. Now this code could also cache that HTML if you wanted that sort of functionality, but for a simple website, this might be exactly what you want. So if we come back here and we refresh, we can see that the shopping cart is still working. But if we look at the network debugging, we'll see that it actually retrieved the cart.html for it and used that as a template for our page. Nothing's changed, just our tooling for it becomes a little easier, that we can actually edit the cart.html to make things a little easier instead of having to deal with it as this embedded monstrosity. So if you really do want to have remote views without having to get into using Webpack or Browserify or one of those tools as a loader, this is a cheap and easy way to actually get it to work. Let's wrap up this module now that we have a good sense of how to build components. So we've been talking about composing with components. I've shown you both a small and a larger version of something that may be a component. I've talked about packaging up the components either locally or globally. And we've talked about reusing the components across different pages and how that works. So far, we really haven't dug into the hard problem with components, and that is how to share data. So far, we have simply had the main view hold on to all the data and then pass it down into the components. They may not be what you want in most instances. So in the next module, we'll talk about how to use data with a component-based architecture.